The morning Margaret Blackwood told my twin boys they couldn't play basketball in their own driveway was the morning I decided to wage war against the most corrupt Homeowners Association in Texas. $300. That's what Sunset Ridge, HOA, charged me for allowing my grieving children to bounce a ball after 7 p.m. What they didn't know was that I had just inherited $12 million and 20 years of experience in corporate law. If you're watching this while hiding from your own HOA nightmare, leave a comment telling me your worst story. I promise what happened next will blow your mind. My name is David Mitchell, and until 6 months ago, I thought the biggest challenge in my life would be raising 2 10-year-old boys as a single father. My wife Jennifer died in a car accident last winter, leaving me to navigate parenthood alone while grieving the love of my life. The boys, Tyler and Mason, had been struggling with the loss. Their grades dropped, they stopped playing with friends, and most nights ended with tears and questions I couldn't answer. Our family therapist suggested maintaining routines and finding healthy outlets for their emotions. Basketball had always been their escape. Jennifer used to joke that our garage sounded like a war zone with the constant dribbling and shooting. After she passed, I noticed that the 20 minutes the boys spent shooting hoops each evening were the only times they seemed like themselves again. When we moved to Sunset Ridge Estates, I specifically chose a house with a wide driveway and a basketball hoop already installed. The community seemed perfect on paper. Top-rated schools, family-friendly amenities, and a reputation for being a safe place to raise children. The realtor mentioned an active homeowners association, but described it as focused on maintaining the beautiful neighborhood standards. Everything changed on a Tuesday evening in March. Tyler and Mason were practicing free throws after dinner when a stern woman in her 50s approached our driveway. She wore a crisp business suit despite the casual hour and carried a clipboard like a weapon. Her graying hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent scowl. The boys immediately stopped playing, sensing the tension in her purposeful stride. "Excuse me, but this noise violation ends now," she announced without introducing herself. "I'm Margaret Blackwood, president of the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association, and you're violating Noise Ordinance Section 12.4. She held up her phone, which was recording video of my confused children holding their basketball. Tyler, always the braver of the twins, looked at me uncertainly. "Dad, we're just playing basketball," he said quietly. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she focused on him. "Young man, this community has rules for a reason. After 7 p.m., outdoor recreational activities that create noise are strictly prohibited. Your parents should have educated you about community standards before allowing this behavior." The way she spoke to my children, like they were criminals rather than kids playing in their own driveway, triggered something protective and furious inside me. "I'm sorry, but I wasn't aware of any noise restrictions for normal children's activities," I said, stepping between Margaret and the boys. "Is there a community handbook I should review?" She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made you check your wallet. "Mr. Mitchell, ignorance of established regulations isn't an excuse. All homeowners receive monthly newsletters detailing community standards. Perhaps you should pay closer attention to official communications." I had been checking my mail religiously since moving in, specifically looking for HOA information, but had received nothing beyond welcome packets. "I haven't received any newsletters," I replied. "Could you provide me with copies of the regulations you're referencing?" Margaret's smile widened, becoming almost predatory. "The violation notice and corresponding fine will be delivered within 24 hours. $500 for the noise violation, plus an additional $200 for failure to maintain awareness of community standards. I suggest you use this time to educate yourself and your children about how we do things here at Sunset Ridge." That night, after putting 2 confused and upset boys to bed, I did what any attorney would do. I researched everything about Sunset Ridge HOA and Margaret Blackwood. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. Margaret had been HOA president for 12 consecutive years, running unopposed in most elections. Her day job was working as a senior property manager for Pinnacle Realty, a company that specialized in high-end residential communities. The pattern that emerged from public records was troubling. Over the past decade, 43 families had moved out of Sunset Ridge after facing excessive HOA violations and fees. Property records showed that 31 of those homes were subsequently purchased by shell companies with indirect connections to Pinnacle Realty, often at below-market prices due to ongoing HOA disputes that mysteriously resolved immediately after sale. I also discovered that Margaret's interpretation of HOA rules was creative, to say the least. The noise ordinance she cited was part of a document that technically required a majority vote of homeowners to implement. No such vote had ever taken place. Instead, Margaret had simply declared it policy during a sparsely attended board meeting, where only her allies were present. Her selective enforcement was equally problematic. Security camera footage from neighbors revealed that other children regularly played outside after 7 p.m. without any consequences. The most revealing discovery came from diving deep into HOA financial records, which as a homeowner I had the legal right to review. Margaret had been approving payments to numerous vendors with connections to Pinnacle Realty, often for services that seemed questionable at best. Landscaping contracts that were 3 times market rate, security services that provided no visible security, and maintenance agreements for facilities that appeared to maintain themselves. My neighbor, Patricia Williams, a retired school principal, approached me while I was researching on my front porch the following morning. She had witnessed the confrontation with Margaret and was visibly upset. "That woman has been terrorizing families in this neighborhood for years," Patricia said, glancing around nervously. "Most people are afraid to speak up because she controls property values and recommendations for prospective buyers." Patricia introduced me to several other residents who had similar experiences with Margaret's reign of terror. There was Robert Thompson, a military veteran whose flagpole had been deemed non-compliant after he spoke against a proposed fee increase. Linda Chen, a nurse whose night shift parking had been cited as a violation despite having no impact on anyone. And most heartbreaking elderly couple Frank and Rose Martinez, who had received 17 violation notices in 2 months after Frank questioned Margaret's budget proposals at a board meeting. We began meeting quietly at Patricia's house every Thursday evening, sharing stories and documenting Margaret's pattern of abuse. What emerged was a clear strategy of intimidation designed to maintain control through fear. Margaret had turned homeownership into a constant anxiety for dozens of families, creating an atmosphere where people were afraid to use their own properties. Normally, the group grew organically as word spread through careful, trusted channels. Soon we had representatives from nearly half the neighborhood's homes. Each person brought documentation of selective enforcement, questionable fees, and intimidation tactics. Linda Chen, with her medical background, had been keeping detailed records and noticed that families with young children or elderly members were disproportionately targeted, as if Margaret specifically chose those she perceived as vulnerable. Robert Thompson's military investigative skills proved invaluable in uncovering the financial connections between Margaret and various contractors who received HOA payments. "She's been running a protection racket disguised as community management," he concluded, after reviewing months of financial data. "Pay her friends for services, create problems for residents who question the system, then profit when they're forced to sell at reduced prices." My background in corporate law provided advantages that Margaret hadn't anticipated. I began by filing formal requests for complete HOA documentation going back 10 years, including board meeting minutes, financial records, and all correspondence with vendors. As a homeowner, I had the legal right to this information, though Margaret attempted to delay and obstruct at every opportunity. While waiting for the documents, I researched Texas Homeowners Association law extensively. What I discovered was that Margaret had been operating far outside her legal authority for years. Many of her regulations had never been properly voted on by the community. Several fees and fines exceeded statutory limits. And most importantly, the HOA's governing documents required board elections every 2 years, not the informal continuations that had kept Margaret in power. I also consulted with a specialist in real estate law who confirmed my suspicions about the property acquisition scheme. This pattern you're describing is actually a form of organized real estate fraud, explained attorney Sarah Collins during our confidential consultation. Using HOA enforcement to artificially depress property values for personal gain is prosecutable under both civil and criminal statutes. The breakthrough came when I received my inheritance paperwork from my aunt's estate, $12 million from her successful technology investments, along with detailed instructions about using wealth responsibly to help others. The timing seemed almost providential. Here I was, facing a corrupt system that was hurting my children and neighbors, with suddenly having the resources to fight back properly. My strategy crystallized around a simple principle that had served me well in corporate law. When facing a corrupt system, don't just challenge the corruption, replace the entire system. Margaret's power came from her control over the HOA and her connections to local real estate interests. If I could neutralize both sources of power simultaneously, her entire operation would collapse. The first phase involved purchasing the debt obligations of key properties in the neighborhood, particularly those belonging to Margaret and her closest allies. Using my inheritance and existing investment connections, I quietly approached Sunset Ridge National Bank about buying the mortgage notes on specific properties. The bank, facing regulatory pressure to reduce risky real estate exposure, was surprisingly willing to negotiate. Within 3 weeks, I owned the debt on Margaret's own home, plus 6 properties belonging to board members and major contractors who had been profiting from HOA expenditures. This gave me significant leverage without breaking any laws or harming innocent homeowners. My plan was to use this leverage strategically, not to foreclose on anyone, but to force accountability. Simultaneously, I began purchasing empty lots and available properties throughout the neighborhood whenever they came on the market. My goal was to accumulate enough voting power to force legitimate HOA elections and implementation of transparent governance. Each property purchase represented multiple votes in HOA decisions, votes that Margaret had been controlling through intimidation and manipulation. The property acquisitions were handled through a carefully structured trust that maintained privacy while ensuring everything remained completely legal. I consulted with tax attorneys and real estate specialists to ensure my strategy couldn't be challenged on technical grounds. Every move was documented and verified to withstand scrutiny. By month 2 of my campaign, I owned or controlled mortgage obligations representing 38% of the neighborhood properties. Combined with the growing coalition of supporters, we had enough influence to demand real change. Margaret began to notice the shifting dynamics but couldn't identify the source of the new opposition to her authority. Margaret's response to increasing resistance was predictably aggressive. She called an emergency HOA meeting and announced a special assessment requiring each household to pay an additional $300 monthly for enhanced security and community improvements. The assessment was clearly designed to drive out families she couldn't control while funding her allies' continued profits. Recent security concerns and property maintenance issues require immediate action, Margaret announced to the packed community center meeting room. These enhanced fees will ensure Sunset Ridge maintains its premium status and property values. She had prepared professional-looking presentations and detailed budget projections, all designed to make her cash grab appear legitimate. When Patricia Williams raised her hand to question the assessment, Margaret immediately cut her off. "Mrs. Williams, I believe you're behind on understanding the current security challenges we're facing. Perhaps you should spend more time reviewing official communications instead of gossiping with neighbors." The public humiliation was intended to discourage further questions. I stood up from the back of the room. "Actually, Margaret, I'd like to understand the legal basis for this assessment. According to the HOA governing documents, special assessments over $100 require a vote by 75% of homeowners, not a board decision." Margaret's confident expression faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Mr. Mitchell, you seem confused about HOA operations. The board has full authority to implement necessary community improvements. She gestured dismissively. Perhaps if you spent less time encouraging your children to violate noise ordinances and more time understanding community governance, you'd be better informed. The personal attack on my parenting, delivered publicly, was clearly intended to embarrass me into silence. Instead, I smiled and pulled out a folder of documents. Actually, Margaret, I've been doing quite a bit of research on community governance. Would you like me to share what I've discovered about unauthorized vendor contracts and selective enforcement patterns? The room fell completely silent. Margaret's face drained of color as she realized I wasn't going to be intimidated like previous challengers. Since we're discussing community governance, I continued, I think homeowners deserve to know about some interesting financial arrangements that have been happening without their knowledge. I opened my folder and began reading from official documents. Over the past 5 years, this HOA has paid over $400,000 to contractors and service providers with direct connections to board members or their employers. Margaret tried to interrupt, but I continued calmly. Pinnacle Realty, where our president works, has received over $80,000 in property management fees, despite the community having no rental properties requiring management. Blackwood Security Services, owned by Margaret's brother-in-law, has received $60,000 for security services that apparently consist of driving through the neighborhood twice a week. The murmuring in the room grew louder as homeowners began to understand the implications. Furthermore, I said, holding up more documents, the special assessments and violation fines collected over the past 3 years have totaled nearly $200,000, but only 30% of that money can be accounted for in legitimate community improvements. Patricia Williams found her voice. Are you saying our HOA fees have been paying for Margaret's personal business interests? Before I could answer, Margaret exploded. This is slander. Mr. Mitchell is a disruptive influence who's been spreading lies and poisoning community relationships since he arrived. His children are undisciplined, his property maintenance is substandard, and his attitude toward community standards is completely unacceptable. I waited for her outburst to end, then responded quietly, Margaret, since you've made this personal, let me share something else with the community. I recently purchased the mortgage notes on several properties in this neighborhood, including yours. I also own 4 vacant lots and 2 rental properties that have been listed for sale. Combined with the homeowners here tonight who are supporting governance reform, that represents about 60% of community voting power. The room erupted in shocked conversation. Margaret's face went through several colors before settling on pale gray. You can't do that, she stammered. There are rules about outside influence. I smiled. Actually, Margaret, I checked the rules very carefully. Everything I've done is completely legal and properly documented, unlike the unauthorized assessments and selective enforcement you've been implementing for years. Within 2 weeks, we had organized legitimate HOA elections with proper notice and transparent voting procedures. Margaret and her entire board were voted out by a margin of 78%. Patricia Williams was elected as the new president, with Robert Thompson as treasurer and Linda Chen as secretary. The new board's first action was hiring an independent accounting firm to audit all HOA finances. The audit revealed over $300,000 in questionable expenditures and unauthorized contracts. Margaret was forced to repay substantial amounts and faced investigation by local authorities for potential fraud. Her connection to the property acquisition scheme led to a broader investigation of Pinnacle Realty's business practices. Most importantly, we implemented new governance rules with term limits, mandatory financial transparency, and a community bill of rights protecting homeowners from arbitrary enforcement. The basketball hoop in my driveway became a symbol of the changes, with a small plaque reading, Jennifer's Court, installed by the new board in honor of my wife's memory. 6 months later, Sunset Ridge had become a model community where families felt safe to let their children play outside without fear of harassment. Margaret had moved away after selling her house to cover legal fees and restitution payments. The boys were thriving in school again, and our Thursday evening basketball games had grown into a neighborhood tradition, where kids and parents gathered for fun instead of fear. As I watch Tyler and Mason laugh with their friends in our driveway each evening, I'm reminded that sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory isn't through mourning, but through fighting for the values they believed in. Jennifer always said that bullies only win when good people decide it's easier to stay quiet. She would have been proud to see our community choose courage over convenience and justice over keeping the peace. If you're dealing with HOA corruption, your own neighborhood, remember that documentation, legal knowledge, and community organization can overcome even the most entrenched power structures. Sometimes it takes someone with resources and determination to stand up first, but once you show others that change is possible, you'll be amazed how many people are ready to fight for what's right.